We have two professors who are going to address us tonight. The first is Professor Catherine Chatterley. She is the founding director of the newly established Centre, Canadian Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, it's called, the Canadian Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which was recently featured in an extensive article by Bob Hepburn in the Toronto Star. She is a respected historian of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Professor Chatterley teaches modern European and Jewish history at the University of Manitoba and writes on a variety of subjects, including anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and contemporary Europe. Born in Winnipeg, she studied European intellectual history and modern Jewish history at the University of Manitoba, Concordia in Montreal, and did her doctorate at the University of Chicago. The Centre, the Canadian Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, was founded in the summer of 2010 to facilitate both scholarly study of anti-Semitism and to educate Canadians about it. Her most recent book, Disenchantment, George Steiner and the Meaning of Western Civilization After Auschwitz, is the first intellectual biography of the famous and formidable literary and cultural critic George Steiner. Disenchantment, which has received critical acclaim, was honored as a 2011 National Jewish Book Award finalist. So I invite Professor Chatterley to begin our exchange tonight with her talk.
Can everybody hear me all right? The back of the room too? Good. I want to thank CEJA for inviting me to Toronto and for the congregation as well to attend this evening. It's a full room. It's wonderful to see. My goal this evening is to try to explain historically how anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which are two distinct ideologies, have increasingly converged over the last 64 years. We know that historically, anti-Zionism was a Jewish phenomenon, part and parcel of Jewish life, thought, and debate in Europe. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were Jews on the left, Bundists and communists, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and many in Western Europe, specifically Jews in Germany, who strongly opposed Zionism without being anti-Semitic. It has also been historically an Arab phenomenon, in reaction to growing settlement of Jews in and around Jerusalem from the 19th century onward. The Arab rejection of increased Jewish immigration to the region and to any kind of independent Jewish state was not so much a function of anti-Semitism, but a clear rejection of any competitive claim to the land they viewed as their own. In other words, it is impossible to imagine the Arabs agreeing to partition their land with anyone. Anti-Semitism, by contrast, is not a phenomenon produced by Arabs or by Jews. It is not a common form of human hostility or even hatred, or a form of racism, the way people think it is. It is a unique, complex, millennial phenomenon that few people actually understand. Anti-Semitism is the specific product of the rancorous divorce between Judaism and the Jesus movement of the first century, which evolves into what we know as Christianity. The impetus of anti-Semitism is theological. That is its uniqueness and its strength. The character of the Jew, which I place in quotation marks to distinguish this character from real existing Jews, is a fiction produced by theology and augmented by European mythologies that grow out of this same theological tradition. The accusations of the blood libel and host desecration are only two examples. In theocratic societies like those of pre-modern Europe, theology affected every aspect of life. The rigid Christian conceptualization of the Jews as a deicide people, those who rejected and killed Christ, led to the systematic exclusion of Jews as a collectivity from mainstream Christian society, to their deep and abiding marginalization, eventual demonization, and to their uniquely peculiar positioning in Western societies as middlemen associated with the despised money occupations. What we see in the history of anti-Semitism is a compounding of stigmatization and hatred, which over time results in the production of a composite character that integrates religious and economic themes in a powerfully reinforcing manner. As my second book illustrates, the theology of the Church and its teachings of contempt for Jews and Judaism resulted in the construction of what I term the anti-Semitic imagination during the period of the High Middle Ages, which is approximately 1000 to 1300 CE, a phenomenon that continues to evolve over centuries and remains with us today. The continent of Europe was Christianized by approximately 1000 CE, albeit unevenly and idiosyncratically in many places. It is during these specific centuries that anti-Semitism becomes a popular mass phenomenon, and the character of the Jew enters the collective imagination of Christian Europe. This vivid, image-obsessed imagination was fed incessantly, both visually and orally, meaning by the ear, through painting, sculpture, woodcuts, reliefs on buildings, passion plays, religious holidays and services, stories, sermons, liturgy, folk tales, hymns, and songs. This medieval Christian imagination had a character at its center that appeared to have the power and determination to control the world, to manipulate and control rulers, and to influence events, thereby wreaking utter havoc in society. That character, that figment of the European imagination, was the Jew. For Europeans, he was the tormentor and killer of Christ, the savior of universal humanity according to Christian theology, who continued until the end of time to work against the church, against its gospel and its congregations. He was the ritual murderer and host desecrator who compulsively reenacted the crucifixion through these homicidal Jewish rituals. The well poisoner and the magician, both of whom were in league with Satan in a war against the church. Remember John's Gospel, in which Jesus himself is purported to say that Jews are the children of the devil. And of course, the Jew was a usurer who recalled Judas Iscariot, the tax collector and archetypal traitor who betrayed his friend Jesus with a kiss and sold him out to the temple authorities for 30 pieces of silver. It is this caricature of the Jew that fueled the anti-Semitic imagination. And it is by the appearance of this character that we know we are in the presence of anti-Semitism and not a more common form of xenophobia or hostility. This character that Europe produces in the 12th century and begins to export in the 16th is remarkably consistent across time and space. Regardless of European region, religious denomination, language, or nationality, the general characteristics and qualities attributed to the Jew are static and monotonous. He is conspiratorial, manipulative, dishonest, vengeful, hateful, unrelentingly cruel and unforgiving. He is arrogant, blind to the truth, corrupted especially by money and power, treasonous, traitorous, criminal, and at bottom, motivated by evil. Many assume that the anti-Semitism we call Christian passed away under the pressures of modernity, but that is not the case. The traditional Christian edifice of anti-Jewish hostility with its stereotypes and accusations persists through the period of Enlightenment into the 20th century and still exists in parts of the Western population in explicit religious terms today. Modern secularists in Europe held many of the same negative perceptions of Jews and accused them of similar transgressions, but these were explained in new ways. In other words, Jews were still perceived to be a destructive force in society, but for racial reasons rather than as a function of their religion. Racists introduced new variations on established anti-Jewish themes in the modern period after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The classic accusations of Christian anti-Semitism were translated and used to explain the new political and economic changes taking place in Europe. So, for example, instead of conspiring against Jesus and the gospel, the Jews were now believed to be conspiring against the nation-state to advance the interests of their own so-called race. The economic themes found in the Gospels became even more central to modern anti-Semitic thinking, as money was increasingly seen to be the primary vehicle of purported Jewish domination in the modern world. All forms of anti-Semitism have been exported along with other products of Western culture to all the places Europeans have settled. Europeans have transmitted anti-Semitism through culture, religion, and imperialism. It has also been disseminated on a global scale by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. During World War II, anti-Semitism was introduced into the Arab world by Nazi Germany via radio programs broadcast in Arabic and by the translation and distribution of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda, including Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, the Tsarist forgery that is unfortunately today thought of as a history text and included in children's textbooks throughout the Arab and Islamic worlds. New research by Jeffrey Herf and Matthias Kunzel into the relationship between Nazism and the Arab world demonstrates the conscious attempt on the part of the Nazi regime to befriend the Arabs and all followers of Islam by suggesting an alliance against the common enemies of Bolshevism, Great Britain, the United States, all of which were believed to be under the control of the Jewish conspiracy to control the planet. To give you an idea of the tone of these Arabic broadcasts from Berlin, I'll quote from just one titled Roosevelt and the Jews, which aired on November 26, 1942. Quote, Roosevelt has thrown off the mask and proved beyond any doubt that he is a toy in the hand of the Jews by his collaboration with the Jewish element in his aggression in North Africa. The statement goes on to cite support in the United States for the formation of a Jewish home in Palestine, which, quote, confirms that Roosevelt and the White House are just tools in the hands of the Jews who are conspiring against the Arabs with the object, ultimately, of laying their hands on Palestine by force. It is therefore the duty of every Arab to be aware of the Jewish danger and to be aware of Roosevelt, who is the right hand of the Jews, end quote. These kinds of anti-Semitic themes targeted decision makers in the Arab and Islamic worlds during World War II and were broadcast from Germany in Arabic and Persian from 1939 until the end of the war. The convergence between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism continued to gather strength in the period after 1948, once the State of Israel was established. The accusation that Zionism is racist and imperialist by nature was first made by the Soviet Union, whose conception of Zionism drew on the long tradition of anti-Semitism articulated by elements of the European left, who identified Jewish nationalism and capitalist imperialism with Judaism and the Jewish bourgeoisie. Within this political tradition, Jewish nationalism was seen as divisive and reactionary, opposed to progressive politics, and based upon an artificial ethnic religious construct that elevated Jews above other peoples. The USSR voted for partition in 1947 because Stalin thought its socialist founders would place it firmly in the Soviet orbit. However, within a year of the establishment of the State of Israel, Stalin began to see Zionism as a serious threat to the Soviet Union and its interests. Israel was accused of working in tandem with American imperialism, both in the Middle East and as part of a wider conspiracy inside the USSR. From 1949 until his death in March 1953, Stalin engaged in a full assault on the Jews of the Soviet Union, who were then considered bourgeois nationalists, rootless cosmopolitans, and a Zionist fifth column. Soviet anti-Semitism fixated on Zionists and their so-called conspiracy with Western capitalism and imperialism. And it is this Soviet thinking and rhetoric that was introduced into the republics of Eastern Europe, throughout the developing post-colonial world, including the Arab states, and into the United Nations. The Six-Day War in June 1967 was a crushing defeat for the Arab armies, but also for the USSR and its international prestige. From this point forward, Soviet anti-Zionist rhetoric regularly used Nazi analogies, accusing Israel of behaving like Hitler, practicing racism, fascism, and genocide against the Palestinian Arabs. In a redeployment of classic European anti-Semitic tropes, Zionists were accused of having a controlling influence in the Western media, industry, and banking, and were accused of working with the United States to advance their interests against those of international communism. In his most recent history of anti-Semitism entitled The Lethal Obsession, which can keep a door open, Robert Wistrich discusses the historical development and distribution of this Soviet anti-Zionist ideology in explicit detail, and illustrates how its strategy to isolate and delegitimize Zionism precipitated the 1975 UN Resolution 3379, which stated that, quote, Zionism is a form of racism and racist discrimination, end quote. Another resolution that same year, number 77, stated that, quote, the racist regime in occupied Palestine and the racist regime in Zimbabwe and South Africa have a common imperialist origin, forming a whole and having the same racist structure and being organically linked in their policy aimed at repression of the dignity and integrity of the human being, end quote. And again that year, the non-aligned countries released a political declaration and strategy to strengthen international peace and security, which condemned Zionism, quote, as a threat to world peace and security, and called upon all countries to oppose this racist and imperialist ideology, end quote. 2 years earlier, UN Resolution 3151 had condemned, quote, the unholy alliance between South African racism and Zionism, end quote. Clearly, these accusations and the apartheid analogy which we are familiar with today are not new. However, they were never commonly accepted in the West, and therefore they had no real impact on our mainstream thinking. Today, this is no longer the case. UN Resolution 3379, the Zionism is Racism resolution, was finally annulled in 1991, the same year that the Soviet Union collapsed. But its echoes were heard again at Durban 1, the World Conference Against Racism, held from August 31st to September 8th, 2001, under UN auspices in South Africa. Charged with discussing a number of controversial subjects, including slavery and reparations, much of the conference was dedicated to the so-called racist crimes of Zionism. It is important to note that at this supposed anti-racist conference, the protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, the most libelous anti-Semitic text in history, was distributed to delegates by the Palestinian Solidarity Committee of South Africa. 4 years after Durban, in 2005, Israeli Apartheid Week was born in Toronto. That July, 170 Palestinian civil society organizations released an official call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, better known as BDS, against Israel until it complied with international law. This document clearly stated that the call by Palestinian civil society was modeled on the example of the South African struggle against apartheid. Quote, we, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations and peoples of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era. We appeal to you to pressure your respective states to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. We also invite conscientious Israelis to support this call for the sake of justice and genuine peace. These non-violent, punitive measures should be maintained until Israel meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law by 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So, Israeli Apartheid Week was created in Toronto to support the BDS movement, and both advocate for a one-state solution to the conflict in the Middle East, which clearly means the erasure of a state with a Jewish majority, which of course is the stated purpose of the Zionist movement. Today we are seeing the results of Western anti-Semitic propaganda in Arab and Islamic media, school curricula, and unfortunately, in general thinking about the conflict with Israel. In the last several decades, the anti-Semitism of Europe has been Islamized, translated, in other words, made native to the culture, sensibilities, and politics of the Islamic and Arab worlds. The anti-Semitic themes unique to Europe, such as Jewish conspiracy, child killing, bloodlust, nihilism, and cosmic evil, are now common currency on the Arab street, finding their way into the culture from cartoons to sermons. The imagined characteristics thought to be inherent in the Jew, whether because of religion or later because of biology, remain consistent across time, and now they appear to be consistent across cultures. Today, those imaginary qualities are increasingly attributed to the Zionist and to Zionist Jews, for those who bother to make a distinction between Jews, or to the Zionist political lobby, or to diaspora Jewry in general, which supports the State of Israel. Since 2000, anti-Semitism has become a truly globalized phenomenon, and for the first time in history, it is flourishing outside a Christian cultural context. The internet and satellite television are the main vehicles by which anti-Semitism travels today. Increasingly, anti-Semitic accusations are being directed toward Jews in public through the rhetorical assault on a Jewish political philosophy and a Jewish nation state. In many cases, so-called criticism of Zionism and Israel uses the language and thematic structure of the most traditional European anti-Semitism. Interestingly, this assault on the Jewish state and its philosophy mimics the older Christian assault on Judaism, whereby one tried to argue that anti-Judaism was not anti-Semitic, but simply reflective of the legitimate anti-Judaic foundations of the church. In other words, one could be anti-Judaic without being anti-Semitic, which meant that one could reject the Jewish religion without rejecting the Jewish people per se. Many anti-Zionists and anti-Israelists are now using the same unconvincing argument for the same reason. If their political position is to be progressive and emancipatory, it cannot be tainted with anti-Semitism. In 2012, no one wants to be an anti-Semite except those on the neo-Nazi fringe. Contemporary anti-Semitism is a complex compound. There is considerable debate today over definitions of anti-Semitism and where exactly the line exists between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, if one exists at all. These are very important questions for scholars, and one wonders whether the definition of anti-Semitism should be expanded to include so-called new forms, or whether a more strict historical definition should be adhered to and new language used to characterize equally threatening anti-Jewish phenomena, like anti-Israelism, for example. After 2,000 years, anti-Semitism is a deeply ingrained, one might say habitual, way of thinking about Jews that I believe is endemic to Western culture, and at the same time largely invisible to people. Like sexism, it sometimes has a spectral and liminal presence, which has not yet passed away. In his book, Trials of the Diaspora, Anthony Julius provides a definition of anti-Semitism that speaks to its sometimes amorphous quality in the Western world. He tells us it is, quote, a repertoire of attitudes, myths, and defamations in circulation at any given time. It is a kind of discursive swamp, a resource on which religious and political movements, writers and artists, demagogues and the variously disaffected all draw without ever draining. It is not a political philosophy or anything close to one. It is not a conception of the world. It is merely an idée fixe, a hatred dressed up as a conviction, a protean, unstable combination of received ideas compounded by malice, end quote. One of the challenges we face is the very real lack of understanding on the part of most people about what exactly anti-Semitism is, how it operates, and what it looks and sounds like. For those possessed by the anti-Semitic imagination, whether religious or secular, Christian or Muslim, left, center, or right, the Jew, who is very often referred to today as the Zionist, just as in the Soviet Union, remains inherently unethical, selfish, willfully blind to the truth, overwhelmingly powerful, conspiratorial and deceitful by nature, intent upon achieving world domination, corrosive in effect, and an existential threat to humanity, however that shifting concept is defined, be it Christian, proletarian, Aryan, Islamic, or now global populist. Here, then, are the two quintessential features of anti-Semitism: the caricature of the Jew and the Manichaean delusion of Western history that pits this evil, fictitious image against good and just humanity, both powerful imaginary abstractions. As stated earlier, it is by the appearance of this character that we know we are in the presence of anti-Semitism and not a more common form of xenophobia or hostility, or even of normal human hatred, which is the product of war. This caricature is not the invention of Islam, or of antiquity, or of the Arab world, or Asia. It is the specific product of Western civilization and its Christian theological foundation. The Jew has, however, unfortunately, found a very useful purpose in the Middle East, and the anti-Semitism of Europe has been Islamized, or made native to the region and its traditions, for political purposes in the struggle against Israel. For example, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion is used today to explain the politics and economics of the Middle East and beyond, the same way this Russian forgery was used to explain supposed Jewish machinations in Europe and America during the 20th century. Some specific Christian themes have an uneasy relationship to Islam and are translated in different ways for a Muslim audience today. For example, the Christian blood libel is used today in Arab and Islamic worlds, to accuse Jews in Israel of killing children, of harvesting organs, and of bloodlust in general. Interestingly, what is missing in Muslim depictions of the blood libel is the ritual remurdering of Christ, which is the heart and soul of the European accusation, and does continue to persist in Christian anti-Israel propaganda. Some of you may remember the cartoon from 2002 from La Stampa, with baby Jesus laying in the manger and an Israeli tank approaching, and the baby is made to say, "Please don't let them kill me again." This part of the libel does not translate easily into Islam, because the crucifixion is a fallacy according to Muslim theologians, so propagandists fixate on blood and child killing in general. The truly frightening aspect of anti-Semitism, regardless of where it appears, remains the provocative and threatening nature of the fictitious character at its center. The Jew literally provokes resistance in the form of attack from those who believe he exists. The violence, be it physical or rhetorical, that one perpetrates against the Jew is always justified because it is conceived by its very nature as an act of self-defense. All anti-Semites, regardless of time and place, see themselves as victims of the Jew. This makes anti-Semitism a particularly dangerous fixation, one that we should all work to uproot regardless of our specific political orientations or our perspectives on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you.